There we go. Thank you. Well, it's good to be back with you this morning. Let me read to you a quote and think about it with you for a second. We're talking about Joseph from the book of Genesis this weekend, and so we're going to get into Genesis 41 and 42 in just a minute here. Yeah, I think it's on. Thanks, Stuart. This is a quotation from a prosecutor, district attorney in Cleveland. His name is Brian Radigan, and he was this was on a podcast that I listened to, and he was talking about like what sort of sentencings he tries to recommend to the judge. How long do we want people to go away? How much punishment do we need to mete out to people for certain crimes? That's what he's talking about. And he says what he tries to do, he says his job is to aim for a punishment big enough to trigger the healing power of retribution. The healing power of retribution. Now, can you think about that and think about his job, the kinds of people he deals with, and what would that mean? Do you think that retribution has healing power? Or, well, he thinks it does, right? Brian Radigan does. What does he mean by that? In the people punished. Okay.
I feel like it's talking about the victims feel better.
Yeah. Okay.
Victimizer has been punished.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you took it in the way you took it, because I had not thought of taking it that way, that it can be, in a way, healing for the criminal to bring about reform. I took it more in the way Phil took it, that it's healing to the victim or the victim's family. Let's say there's a murder that takes place, and let's say that crime goes unsolved for a period of time. I think we can imagine the victim's family feeling like this is some outstanding weight upon them that they can't get over. They just want to bring closure. We hear that term closure a lot in these sorts of contexts. And that maybe after a couple of years, some evidence comes up, DNA evidence, they can link it to a particular person. He is tried and convicted, and maybe at that point the victim's family would say that they have now, closure has been brought about. It's interesting. I think we could probably take it in both ways. The healing power of retribution. Well, we are talking about Joseph. And when we look at Genesis, the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 37, and we read to the end, at least a big part of what this story is about a family that falls apart and slowly comes back together. I want to read in Genesis 41, and then we're going to get into Genesis 42. Let me grab some water here. Genesis 41 is starting about where we read last night, where it turns out that Joseph is able to interpret some dreams for Pharaoh. He comes up with this good plan, Pharaoh thinks, to store away some grain during the times of plenty so that they'll have some during the times of famine. Pharaoh elevates Joseph to second in command of all Egypt. He gives him a signet ring. He gives him new clothes. He gives him a wife. He gives him a new name. The new name is Zaphanath-Paneah. No longer will he be called Joseph. Now he is Zaphanath-Paneah. Now, the text always calls him Joseph, right? When we're reading in Genesis, Genesis never calls him Zaphanath-Paneah except that one time. But I can imagine that everybody else, Pharaoh would say, tell Zaphanath-Paneah to come. He wouldn't say, tell Joseph, come see me. Tell Zaphanath-Paneah to come see me. And when the people come to buy grain, I think they say, can we see Zaphanath-Paneah? Because we need to buy some grain. They're not going to say, can we see Joseph? All right? This is his new name. This is his Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. And then, so he has this new wife, right? This wife is named Asenath. And the text tells us that with this wife, he has some children. This is in verse 50. This is Genesis 41, verse 50. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. I want to think about these kids' names, and I especially want to think about that first kid, Manasseh. Why did Joseph name him Manasseh? Just somebody remind us. That's what he says. What does he say again? God has made me forget. Manasseh means forgetfulness. So he named his first kid Forgetfulness. Why did he name his first kid Forgetfulness? I mean, yeah. I wonder, why would you name your kid that? Yeah, I mean, I think if you name your kid Forgetfulness, you name your kid that to remind yourself to forget all the previous hardship. And he says, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. That's what he says, all my father's house. Now, it's been, we talked about this last night, it had been 13 years. Right? He comes out of prison. What verse is it? 46 that says that? Verse 46 says he was 30 years old when he came out of prison and interpreted those dreams for Pharaoh. Chapter 37 said he was 17 years old when his brother sold him into slavery. So it's 13 years from the time that he had last seen his brothers in his father's house to this point now where he has Asenath, and I don't know, maybe a couple of years later they have their first kid. I don't know, maybe it was 9 months later that they had their first kid, and he decides, I'm going to name this kid Forgetfulness.
Maybe we think that maybe we put different types of emotion or something on a word and what they did. Maybe it was a different.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that was like a good thing, to be able to forget. Maybe
Well,
more than
yeah. Okay, maybe so. I'm going to suggest that Joseph is trying to convince himself that he has forgotten. That maybe it is celebration, but he's still lying to himself, right? Because what we're about to see in chapter 42 is he hadn't forgot a thing. As soon as he sees these 10 men come and kneel before him, it all comes flooding back in his mind. He remembers every detail of his interaction. And I think what he's trying to do by naming his kid this is convince himself that he's over it, that it doesn't matter anymore. He's got to live a new life. He can't be dwelling on the past. He's got to, move forward. But he's kidding himself. So chapter 42, I am assuming that you all have read this section of Genesis a number of times, and you are more or less familiar with what the next few chapters hold, because we're going to talk about the next few chapters sort of big picture. All right, well, I'll remind you of some of the details, because some of the details might be a little hazy in your mind, but we're going to talk big picture about it, and try to figure out what is Joseph thinking. I love chapters 42 to 44. I think they are just wonderful chapters. And part of the reason they're wonderful is because they describe these interactions between Joseph and his brothers, and the brothers and their father. And it's weird. What Joseph does to the brothers, it's strange. And the text doesn't tell us why he's doing it, which means it just putting it on us, figure it out, right? The text of Scripture is giving us the burden of having to figure out, why is Joseph acting this way? Let me remind you of how he acts. The brothers show up, and he recognizes them. Well, it says in verse 7, right, chapter 42. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He said. And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. Although Joseph had recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Now, why do you suppose they didn't recognize him? He looked like an Egyptian. What did they expect about their brother Joseph? Yeah, in fact, they say it here too. Now, let me remind you again. Who are they bowing down in front of? Who is this person? It's Zaphanath-Paneah, right? Okay. So he looks like an Egyptian. They think their brother Joseph is dead. Let's see. They actually say this. Let's keep reading. Verse 9. Joseph also remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them. He said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." But he said to them, "No, you have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one is no more." So there they say it. You know, one of their brothers is dead. That's Joseph. And, of course, Joseph knows they're talking about me. I'm the one they think is dead. The youngest, Joseph knows, that's Benjamin back in Canaan. So they don't recognize Joseph. Why don't they recognize Joseph? Well, he looks like an Egyptian. I mean, probably his face, you know, we've seen the pictures. Probably his face is made up like an Egyptian. He's wearing Egyptian clothes. He's called Zaphanath-Paneah. He's second in command of all Egypt. Even if they didn't think Joseph was already dead, surely Joseph that they sold into slavery is not the second in command of all Egypt. That's just too much. And so they don't recognize him. This entire time, they have these interactions with him, and they don't know who they're interacting with. They so much don't recognize him that a little bit later, they talk among themselves, and they don't realize that Joseph, Zaphanath-Paneah, can understand them, right? Because they've been using an interpreter. Joseph is apparently speaking Egyptian to them and talking through an interpreter. Now let's remember some of the details about what comes next, and then we'll come back and say, why is Joseph doing this? So what's about to happen is Joseph is he accuses them of being spies, And what he says is, what he says, the very next thing is, if you are telling the truth, I need to see that youngest brother. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep 9 of you imprisoned, and I'm going to send one back, and that one can go get the brother. And so what he does is he imprisons all 10 of them for 3 days. And then he comes back in 3 days and says, okay, I tell you what, 9 of you can go back, and I'm just going to keep one. And he keeps Simeon. And the 9 go back, and he says, Zaphanath-Paneah says to them, you're not going to see my face again unless you bring that younger son. And so the 9 know the conditions here. They also have grain. Remember what Joseph did. He put the money in the top of the sacks of grain, and they didn't know it, but they carried their grain home, and they opened it up, and there's their money. They try to convince Jacob, we cannot go back and get more grain unless we take Benjamin, and Jacob says, not a chance in the world I'm letting you take Benjamin. No way. Joseph is dead. Simeon is already dead. This is at the end of chapter 42. Jacob is already writing off Simeon. Simeon is actually a hostage in Egypt, but Jacob's, Simeon is no more, and there's not a chance in the world I'm letting you take Benjamin. He's going to end up dead, I know it. They run out of grain. Finally, Jacob says, okay, fine, I'll let you take Benjamin. Because if I don't, we're all going to end up dead. So they take Benjamin down there. Joseph sees Benjamin. He throws a banquet for them. He gives everybody a bunch of food. He gives Benjamin 5 times as much as everybody else. He sits them, he arranges their seating at the table in birth order. And the text says they looked at each other in wonder. How in the world did he know our birth order? He gives them more grain. I think he puts the money back in the top of the sacks. And then, now we're into chapter 42. And then he gets his silver cup. And he has his steward put the silver cup in the top of Benjamin's sack. He plants it there. He sends them away, and then he tells the steward, now go get him. And the one that has the silver cup, arrest him and bring him back here. All right, so the steward does. He goes and he stops them and he says, halt, in the name of Zaphanath-Paneah. One of you has stolen my master's silver cup. And the brothers say, no way, none of us would do such a thing. The brothers say, well, this is so good we might as well read it. This is chapter 44, verse 9. This is what the brothers say. Should it be found with any one of your servants, let him die. Moreover, the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. All right, that's their offer. They are so convinced none of us have that silver cup. The one who has it, he should die, and the rest of us will become slaves. And listen what the steward says. This is verse 10. He said, even so, in accordance with your words, let it be. I love that, because then he says, just as you said, we're going to do that. And then he completely changes what they said. He says, he with whom it is found shall become my slave, but the rest of you shall go free. That's what the steward says, right? So we're just going to arrest the one that had it, and he's going to be the slave, and the rest of y'all go back to Canaan. Then each one quickly lowered his sack to the ground, and each opened a sack. He searched, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And at this they tore their clothes. Then each one loaded his donkey, and they returned to the city. Then they go back, and what's going to happen then is that Judah steps up, makes a speech, and that at that point, Joseph can't hold back anymore. He weeps, and he reveals himself to his brothers, and there's a reconciliation. So, chapters 42 to 44, all this time, Joseph knew who he was dealing with, but his brothers didn't recognize him. And he deals with them, I mean, it seems to me, pretty harshly the entire time. The text says at the very beginning that he was speaking to them harshly, but it seems like the entire time he's dealing with them in this sort of odd manner. And the question is, why? What is he trying to do? Now, let me say I think there are two major ways of understanding what Joseph is up to here. And I'm going to promote one and not so much the other, but I think the other one is maybe more common. All right, I would say the one that I am not going to promote, that I think is probably a little more common, is this one. That Joseph is trying to test his brothers to see, are they ready? Have they grown up? Are they ready for a reconciliation? And I think this method of interpretation sort of goes in two directions. On the one hand, maybe he's testing them. On the other hand, maybe he is trying to prepare them. But in both cases, what we have is Joseph wants to reconcile with his brothers, but he needs to either test his brothers to see if they are ready for it, or bring his brothers along, prepare his brothers for that reconciliation. Now, I don't like that one as much, and I'll tell you why. Because it seems to me, I mean, maybe Joseph really was like that, but it seems to me that maybe that is not, that method of interpretation does not see Joseph as a real flesh and blood human being who has real emotions. So I wonder, like, would a real flesh and blood human being who had endured the things Joseph endured, would he, upon seeing these brothers again, already just, well, I need to think of a way to bring them along to reconcile? I sort of think he might be mad at them. And it seems to me easier way to interpret this, in line with the text, but also thinking about Joseph as like a real human being, that his motivation here is, it begins with retribution. So, look, I can't necessarily prove that this is what Joseph is thinking and not the other. I think both of them are possible ways of reading this. But let's just think through the story with this idea in mind, and you see if you think it's convincing or not. It seems to me that in chapter 42, he sees these brothers. He has tried to convince himself that he's forgotten all about it. He named his first son Forgetfulness to remind him to forget about all of what had happened. But he sees these brothers, and it all comes flooding back, and, well, they had tried to kill him. It's been 20 years, in fact, hasn't it? 13 years until he came out of prison, but then how many years of plenty were there? There were 7, so 13 plus 7, that's 20. So it had been about 20 years, because they're coming in the years of famine, because they got no food. So it'd been 20 years. Joseph is 37 years old now. That's probably another reason they didn't recognize him, right? 17 to 37. Been 20 years, and he sees these brothers again, these 10, who had tried to kill him, who had sold him into slavery. And I think as soon as he sees them, not only do all the memories come flooding back, but all the emotions as well, including hatred, anger. I don't think hatred is too strong of a word in this instance. Just think about what you might feel if people you had lived with had done to you what Joseph's brothers did to him. And if you had these people at your complete mercy, he's the second in command of all Egypt. He's got the signet ring of Pharaoh. All he has to do is say the word, and they'll be put to death. What word does he need to say? All he has to do is accuse them of treason. What's the punishment for treason usually? It's death. Does he accuse them of treason? He does. He accuses them of the very crime that they would need to be accused of in order to be led away to the gallows right now. I think, he sees them, and all of a sudden this anger and hatred and what you tried to do to me, you are at my mercy now. And all he has to do is say, you are spies, and they will be led away to execution at this very moment. I think there's one other factor in here. How many brothers is it? It's 10. Who's missing? What's Joseph thinking? Yeah.
Now, I got Benjamin, I got David.
Yeah, I have a similar idea in mind. So I think he sees 10. Where's Benjamin? Let's scratch on that. Just yes. What did they do to Benjamin? I'm imagining that's the first thought. Probably the first thought is, aha! And the second thought is, did they kill Benjamin too? Which makes him just even more angry. I'm imagining. I recognize this is speculation. I'm trying to read the text faithfully, imagining that Joseph is a real person. How would a real person handle this situation? I think a real person would wonder, where in the world is Benjamin? I bet they killed him too. And so, look, you are spies, and they say, no, we're not spies. And he says, yes, you are, you're spies. And then they say, this second speech they make, I think, is what changes the whole thing. Because they say, no, we are 12 brothers, and one of them is back with father now. Aha. They didn't kill Benjamin. He's still alive. And his father's still alive. I mean, he didn't, know about the father either. Benjamin is still alive. And I think that comment determines Joseph's next moves, because I'm not so sure that he really wants to see his father at this point. I think what he really wants is to see Benjamin. And the reason I say that is because Benjamin is the one brother. Of course, Benjamin is full-blooded brother. But more than that, Benjamin is the one brother who had no part in the plot against Joseph. And I think Joseph is thinking, I'd really like to see Benjamin again. And that determines what the next few chapters, in my mind, Joseph is not trying to prepare the brothers for a reconciliation. He doesn't want to see these brothers anymore. The first thought was, I want to kill them, but the second thought was, oh wait, I need them to get Benjamin. They are tools to that end. I want Benjamin here. And so what he does at first, he just locks them all up for 3 days. I think he's thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to get to see Benjamin again? And I think what he says to himself is, what I told them that I would send one back and keep 9 here, but there is no way Dad is going to let Benjamin come back if 9 of them are kept back here. I tell you what, I'll switch it. I'll keep 1 here and send 9 back, and hopefully that will convince Dad to allow Benjamin to come back with them, which is eventually what happens. Eventually, it takes some convincing for Jacob to allow that to happen. And so all, the 10, again, Simeon is the hostage. The 10 come, and it's when he sees Benjamin, the text says, this is in chapter 43, he weeps. Let's see, what is that? Verse 30, chapter 43, verse 30. So he went into a private room and wept there. And then you remember, he sends them all away again. He puts that goblet. Let's see. Hopefully that'll last. I'll work on it. He puts that goblet in the top of Benjamin's sack. And what is it that the steward wants? He just wants Benjamin to come back, right? Just the one in whose sack that goblet was found, he comes back and is the slave, and the rest of you, get out of here. We don't want you guys. They all came back. And I'm imagining that when Joseph saw all 10 of them, he thought, what are you guys doing here? I'm trying to get Benjamin to live with me forever. I don't want to see you guys anymore. After what you did to me, I don't want you here. I think, in my mind, these chapters are not so much about Joseph preparing the brothers for a reconciliation. They're more about God preparing Joseph for that reconciliation, trying to bring Joseph along. I think the name of, here, I'll try to, the name of that first son, Manasseh, forgetfulness, is one of the signs, I think, that Joseph has built this armor around his heart when it comes to his family. And he's just going to forget them and try to move on with his life and not worry about that. You know, it's a little curious, isn't it? That he comes out of prison, he becomes second in command of all Egypt, and he makes no attempts to go back to Canaan, to seek out anybody, to find people. Apparently, he made no attempts for that. It seems he's trying to put all that in the past, close it off. And here come his brothers bowing down in front of him. And there are several things, I think, in these chapters that are signs of there's this armor around his heart, and there are these moments where we can find that some of that is sort of flaking away, chinks in the armor, until finally in chapter 45, God has brought about this opportunity for reconciliation. Let me suggest a couple of these chinks in the armor. I mean, of course, the first one is when they mention Benjamin, right? One of them is back, and he thinks, I want to see Benjamin again. And then another one, notice this. We may have read this last night, but this is chapter 42, verse 21. They said to one another, alas, we are paying the penalty for what we did to our brother. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this anguish has come upon us. Look at verse 22. Then Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to wrong the boy? But you would not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. And then verse 23. They did not know that Joseph understood them, since he spoke with them through an interpreter. He turned away from them and wept.
Might that be some healing for retribution?
I think, that's part of the chink in the armor. He wanted retribution, right? That's what he was thinking, is I'm going to get these guys back. But he had never heard some of this stuff before. I mean, one thing is Reuben. Oh, Reuben wasn't in on it. I'm not sure he even realized that at the time, that Reuben was trying to save him. And so he says, oh, not all 10 of them were in on this. Reuben. Now, Reuben was the oldest. Who does Joseph keep back as the hostage? Simeon. Simeon was the second oldest. He's not going to keep back. I think he would have kept back Reuben as the oldest, but he just heard Reuben wasn't in on it. And then the other thing I think this does for Joseph is, I bet, may I speculate a little bit more? I bet for 20 years, Joseph had been thinking, why didn't Joseph go seek them out when he became second in command of all Egypt? They've forgotten all about me. Dad never came looking for me either. They knew that I'd been sold into Egypt. Why didn't any of them come looking for me? If they wanted to reconcile, they could have done that themselves. I bet they've forgotten all about me. I bet they don't even remember me. I bet that was the best day of their life when they sold me and got rid of the favorite son, and now they're living blessed lives up in Canaan. They don't care one bit about me. They probably even forgot my name. And then he hears, what is it again? In verse 21, we are paying the penalty for what we did to our brother. Now, I don't know if Joseph thought that through. I think what Joseph did realize is, they haven't forgotten. I don't know if he thought it through this far, but I think what that shows is, the brothers certainly have not forgotten about that day. That was not the best day of their life. That was the worst day of their life, because every moment after that, every bad thing that happens to them, they think, God is paying us back for what we did to our brother. And that was a day that didn't bring blessing, but brought curse to that family. And they've been thinking about that day and wanting to take back what they did to their brother and just living with guilt and shame for 20 years now. Just looking out for the next time God wants to bring retribution upon them. Hoping and wishing that they could just undo that day. Wishing that they could be punished enough to just get over it, but never getting that opportunity. And so when Joseph hears that, and hears what Reuben had said, he weeps. And I think that's a chink in that armor that he had built around his house, around his heart. That maybe, the brothers aren't quite as evil and wicked as I thought they were. But it still takes some months before he's ready to fully reconcile with them. At the end of chapter 42, when the brothers are sent back, this is the first time they are sent away. And this is verse 35. As they were emptying their sacks, there in each sack was his bag of money. When they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed. And their father Jacob said to them, I am the one you have bereaved of children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin. All this has happened to me. We'll think about that a little bit more later, but just think about Jacob's comment here. I said that for the brothers, I think that day they sold Joseph was the worst day of their life. It brought a curse to them in their own minds. It brought a curse, the guilt of what they had done that they could not get over. I think it also, for Jacob, he had lived somewhat of a blessed life before that moment. But from the time that his sons brought him that bloody coat, Joseph is no more, and so as I said earlier, he's already writing off Simeon. Simeon's just a hostage down in Egypt. I think that's a bit ironic. Joseph thought, I'm going to keep Simeon because that will make them come back to Egypt. They'll have to come back and get Simeon. And it didn't work because Jacob thought, well, Simeon's already dead, so there's no point in going back to Egypt, right? The hostage bit didn't actually accomplish its purpose. And now you would take Benjamin, all this has happened to me. Again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seems like that's a clue that Jacob continually has this dark cloud hanging over his head, and he's interpreting every little thing as, again, this curse that has come upon the family for some reason. That day that the brothers sold Joseph brought that dark cloud. I want to say one more thing about the brothers, and then we'll wrap up class. Back in chapter 37, I just want to point this out. This is chapter 37, verse 32. They had taken the long robe with sleeves to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." This is the coat of many colors, long robe with sleeves, whatever the robe was. They dipped it in blood and they said, "Is this your son's robe?" He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Well, one thing is the great mourning that Jacob was involved in. Another thing is that it was Jacob himself that came up with the story. All the sons did was show him the bloody robe, and the idea came into his mind. They didn't have to say anything. All they had to do, they didn't tell a lie in that count. All they had to do was say, "Is this your son's robe?" And he came up with this terrible story about his son. Joseph himself doesn't know any of that. He doesn't know what they told their dad or anything along those lines. I think when he sees his brothers, he's thinking about the healing power of retribution. But God is leading him to the healing power of forgiveness, which is able to bring more healing to Joseph than the other. And it's when Judah makes this speech in chapter 44 that we'll talk about during the worship service. That's when Joseph breaks down and recognizes the healing power of forgiveness. That retribution isn't going to get it done. It's forgiveness that is going to bring healing to him. Thank you. Appreciate your comments.